California task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Content warning. It contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. Contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Policing. Police have harassed, brutalized, and killed African Americans since the slavery era. The stereotypes created to support slavery and that have carried through to the modern day have resulted in implicit biases against Americans in the American public at large and in our police force due to implicit bias in policing, and the effects of residential segregation. Black communities are paradoxically both under and over-policed depending on the type of crime. 150 The police and the American public see African Americans not as victims, as criminals. The legacy of slavery continues to devalue Black lives today, as police are more likely to stop, arrest, and kill African Americans than white Americans. Patrols. Era, slave patrols, were an early form of policing, and one of the first patrols began in the Carolina colony in the early 1700s. 151 slave patrols were made up of ordinary citizens, like farmers, hotelkeepers, and brickmakers. 152 who banded together to catch, return, and freedom seekers and prevent revolts. 153 Some slave patrol members were community leaders and the enslavers who enslaved large numbers of people in the region. 154 Some slave patrols had written patrol enforcement instructions, member rosters, 155 others were more informal and simply consisted of all adult men in a community. 156 Patrols had many similarities with modern police departments. Much like current police departments, some slave patrols had hierarchical organization structures that mimicked military units with ranks such as. Slave patrols were made up of ordinary citizens, like farmers, hotelkeepers, and brickmakers, who banded together to catch, return, and discipline freedom seekers and prevent revolts. 157 slave patrols also used dogs to attack enslaved people by biting them, but also to instill fear, and used bloodhounds to track down enslaved people. 158 freedom seekers learned to run without shoes and put black pepper in their socks to make the slave patrol's bloodhounds sneeze and throw them off their scent. 159 11 Just legal system. Slave patrols. Police have continued to use dogs against African Americans in the 20th century through the present. Police used dogs against demonstrators during the Civil Rights Movement. 160 The United States Department of Justice noted in its 2015 report that the Ferguson Police Department exclusively set their dogs against individuals, often in cases where doing so was not justified by the danger presented. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, police dogs bit at least 146 people from 2017 to 2019, and almost all of whom were black. 161 Enforcement targeting of black political leaders. Law enforcement agencies have not only targeted African Americans and physically hurt them, but federal government has targeted black political leaders to neutralize their effectiveness, as discussed in Chapter 3, Racial Terror, and Chapter 4, Political Disenfranchisement. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and state intelligence agencies, like the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, civil rights leaders and activists to deter them. The Mississippi Sovereignty Commission openly discussed murdering civil rights activists. 162 and were implicated in false convictions of activists. 163 The Federal Bureau of Investigation has continued surveillance action today against black matter organizers. 164 Policing. Of African Americans live in communities where there are higher rates of violent crime, as described in Chapter 5, Housing Segregation, due to government-sanctioned residential segregation. African Americans are far more likely than white Americans to live in impoverished neighborhoods with higher rates of violent crime. 165-62% of African Americans live in highly segregated, metropolitan areas that experience a high degree of violent crime. Majority of white Americans live in highly advantaged neighborhoods where there is little violent crime. 166 as Dr. Bruce Appleyard testified during the December 7, 2021 task force meeting. There may be a connection with formerly redlined communities and higher rates of police stopping and searching of African Americans. 167. Studies suggest that police treat African Americans differently than white Americans. Some scholars believe that police arrest large numbers of African Americans for relatively minor crimes, such as loitering, drug possession, and driving infractions in 2019. Americans comprised 26% of all arrests, yet they only made up 13.4% of the population. 168 according to a recent large-scale analysis of racial disparities in of nearly 100 million state patrol police stops in 33 states. Found that police officers stop African Americans more often than white drivers relative to their share of the driving age population. 169 drivers, after controlling for age, gender, time, and location, are more likely to be ticketed, searched, arrested when they are black than when they are white. 170 There is also evidence that the bar for searching black drivers is lower than for searching white Americans. 171 A 2021 study of traffic stop data in Florida shows that approximately 42% of police officers in that state discriminate during traffic stops, and that minority drivers are less likely to be able to leave with a warning when compared to white drivers. 172 Another study shows that police use more force against black and Latino suspects in the beginning stages of interactions. 173 Vintage engraving of an African American man running through grass chased by men on horseback with dogs, circa 1880. Chapter 11. Legal system. Some early data also indicates that police may have arrested a large number of African Americans, relative to their proportion of the population, for violating social distancing rules during the COVID-19 pandemic. 174. Some research indicates that American society views African Americans so differently than the rest of the population that marketing professionals have identified and potentially exploited this trend. 175 Marketing has targeted African Americans for consumer products to defy racism and project a middle-class identity. 176 respondents in one study indicated that being well-groomed is a defy racism by showing worthiness. 177. Ongoing fear of racial profiling has an enduring effect on African Americans. Former First Lady Michelle Obama discussed her fears about her daughters becoming the victims of racial profiling. 178 inches The fact that they are good students. White girls, but maybe they're playing their music a little loud, maybe somebody sees the back of their head and makes an assumption. Many of us still live in fear as we go to the grocery store, walking our dogs, or allowing our children to get a license, Obama said. 179. In black communities, such as through stop and frisk techniques, communicates to black men that they are objects of disdain by the state and that their citizenship is degraded. 17 Study of officer-worn body camera footage showed police officers speaking significantly less respectfully to African Americans than to white Americans in everyday traffic stops after controlling for officer race, infraction severity, stop location, and stop outcome. 181. Federal programs and nationwide policing practices have contributed to this over-policing. Operation Pipeline is a federal program in which over 300 state and local law enforcement agencies train officers to use pretextual stops and consent searches on a large scale. interception of the transportation of drugs, broken windows, and aggressive crime prevention strategy, emphasizing arresting people for committing both major and minor offenses, was first implemented in New York City in the 1990s. 182 It resulted in arrests of disproportionate numbers of Latino and Black youth. 183 Under-policing and the dismissal of Black victims. In addition to perceiving African Americans as more dangerous, Americans and police officers are also less likely to view African Americans as victims of crimes, particularly in areas of violence against women and girls. Mass shootings. Evidence of such under-policing is apparent in the popular news coverage of many cases in which law enforcement authorities appear to have ignored the disappearance of Black women, girls, and children. Black women experience more sexual violence. Black women have historically not received the same level of attention as white women following sexual assaults. 184 As one scholar explains, against Black women are poorly investigated and sometimes ignored altogether. When police actually attempt to investigate alleged crimes against Black women, they often believe the victims are not credible. Further, few sexual assault crimes that actually lead to police charges are frequently not pursued by prosecutors. Denying access to justice. 185 Black women and girls are disproportionately more likely to be victims of sex trafficking in the United States than women and girls of other races. 186 Biases are rooted in history. In 1855, a judge instructed a jury that Missouri's laws protecting women who resist sexual assault did not apply to a 19-year-old enslaved woman, Celia, who killed her enslaver when he was attempting to rape her. After she had already endured 5 years of rape resulting in the birth of 2 of his children. 187 And also extends to crimes against Black children. Black children on average remain missing longer than non-Black children. 188 Black women and girls, in particular, missing in numbers larger than their proportion of the population. 189 Not only the police but also the media. 190 typically pay them less attention compared to missing white women and girls. 191 Police and prosecutors times have also improperly handled these cases. 192 In Atlanta, Georgia, during the late 1970s and early 1980s, a serial killer murdered approximately 24 children, many of whom were Black boys. 193 Police arrested and prosecutors convicted Wayne Williams of killing 2 adults. Prosecutors never tried or convicted him of killing any children, even though many believe he murdered the missing children. 194 In fact, prosecutors have never obtained a conviction for the murders of all the missing children. 195 Against Black women are poorly investigated and sometimes ignored altogether. When police actually attempt to investigate alleged crimes against Black women, they often believe the victims are not credible. Similarly, Black transgender and gender non-conforming people receive inadequate police protection, even though they are more likely to suffer violent crime. 196 Advocates have described an increasing epidemic of violence against the transgender community. 197 And studies show that Black transgender women are significantly more likely to experience violence or be murdered compared to white transgender women. 198 In 2019, for example, Black transgender women made up 91% of all transgender people killed by violent crime. 199 Despite experiencing greater levels of violence, transgender people are also less likely to seek and receive help from the police. 200 This is because Black transgender people suffer much higher rates of harassment and assault when interacting with the police. 201 Some very new and limited scholarship shows that mass shootings occur more in Black communities than in other communities and more frequently than is COV. In media reports 202, part of the reason is due to the fact that the definition of mass shootings is different depending on the government agency, and the media tends only to cover mass public shooting rather than mass shootings that grow out of violence between individuals or groups. 203. Employment discrimination. Employment discrimination in police departments against black applicants may exacerbate discrimination. Brutality against African Americans. The Obama administration's Task Force on 21st Century Policing noted in its recommendations that the diversity of the nation's law enforcement agencies was an important aspect in developing community trust in the police. 204. The United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has identified problems with hiring, retention, harassment of black police officers. 205 police officers have publicly complained in news outlets throughout the country about issues around discrimination and harassment against black police officers and correctional officers. 206 These conditions have resulted in many departments that have very few police officers. Some scholars have argued that this lack of diversity in police departments contributes to discrimination and police brutality against African Americans. Police killings. There is a very long history of police officers' killings of African Americans throughout the United States. From the slavery era to present day, this history has not been limited to the southern states. Buddhists discuss it in Chapter 3. Racial terror is also part of California's history. Of thousands of use of force incidents has concluded that African Americans are far more likely than other groups to be the victims of police violence. 207 African Americans are 29 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. 208 In fact, the statistics may be worse than this because to one study of data from 1980 to 2019, more than half of all killings by police in the U.S. go unreported in the USA National Vital Statistics System database, from which some analysis is drawn. 209. There are many well-publicized examples of police killing African Americans, such as George Floyd, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Breonna Taylor, Louisville, Kentucky. 210 Some have died while in police custody, like Sandra Bland in Waller County, Texas. Others have likely died because of police neglect. Matrice Richardson, who disappeared in Malibu, California in 2009.